Hey adventurer, welcome back to The Weary Wanderer. Tonight we're journeying deep, deep down into the soot-stained reality of the Victorian era, following 10-year-old Billy Cartwright, a child coal drawer, through one absolutely lung-busting, back-breaking, and soul-crushing day. Before we descend into the inky blackness where childhood went to die, if you genuinely enjoy these little trips into history's most spectacularly awful jobs, and let's be honest, who doesn't love a bit of well-documented misery from a safe distance? Then take a moment to subscribe. And for this trip, I'd love to know, what's the worst job you ever had as a kid? Drop it in the comments below. Let's share some collective shudders. Now find a comfortable spot. Maybe dim the lights for atmosphere. Though not too dim, you'll want to see your way out, unlike Billy. Perhaps grab a drink that isn't mine-seeped water, and let's begin our descent into 19th century coal country hell. The world for young Billy Cartwright didn't so much begin each day as it reasserted its cold, damp, and distinctly miserable presence. Sunrise was a rumor, a distant event for people who didn't live their lives in varying shades of black. His current shade was the suffocating pre-dawn black of the one-room hovel he shared with his entire family. It wasn't a cozy black, like a soft blanket. Oh no, this was the black of damp stone walls that wept icy tears. The black of a dirt floor that sucked warmth from anything it touched. And the black currently coating the inside of Billy's eyelids, as he tried to pretend he was still asleep. Sleep, such as it was, happened on a pile of straw and rags in one corner, a communal heap where the Cartwrights, Father Thomas, Mother Sarah, Billy, and the three little uns burrowed together like a litter of shivering puppies. It wasn't for affection, not really. It was for warmth, a desperate shared commodity in the biting chill of late November. The air itself was a thick soup of smells. The stale musk of unwashed bodies, the sour tang of the baby's swaddling, the ever-present damp, and overlaying it all, the metallic, earthy scent of coal dust that clung to his father, and increasingly to Billy himself. It was the family perfume. Something scurried nearby. Billy didn't flinch. Rats were just part of the ambiance, like the persistent drone of his father's cough from the other side of the room. A wet, rattling sound that seemed to shake the very foundations of the hovel and promised another delightful day at the pit. Then there was 10-year-old Emily's snuffly breathing and 6-year-old Lizzie's own tiny, hacking cough that mirrored their father's with a terrifying precision. It was a symphony of suffering, the Cartwright family orchestra tuning up for another command performance. The awakening wasn't gentle, no chirping birds or shafts of golden sunlight. It was his mother's hand, rough and calloused, shaking his shoulder. Billy. Time. Her voice was flat, devoid of morning cheer. Why would there be any? It was by Billy's internal clock, which was calibrated to misery, probably around 4 a.m. The concept of a lie-in was as alien to him as a hot bath or a full belly. He peeled his eyes open to more darkness. The first sensation was the cold. It bit at his exposed skin, a familiar enemy. His small body, all sharp angles and not an ounce of spare flesh, ached. Even at 10, a full day of hauling coal tubs left a residue of pain that sleep never quite managed to wash away. It just sort of marinated overnight. He could feel the imprint of a particularly lumpy bit of straw on his back. Luxury. A groan from the other side of the room. That was Da. The groan was followed by a prolonged bout of coughing, each hack a hammer blow in the stillness. Billy knew that sound. It was the starting gun for their day. He pushed aside the thin, threadbare blanket, a patchwork of salvaged scraps that offered more psychological comfort than actual warmth. The floor was cold. Shockingly, teeth-chatteringly cold. He envied the baby, still snuggled against Ma, blissfully unaware of the joys of capitalism and the urgent need for cheap heating fuel. Now began the daily ritual of dark fumbling. If they were lucky, Ma might light a sliver of a tallow dip, a greasy, sputtering flame that cast more shadows than light and smelled like burnt despair. But tallow cost money, and money was a shy creature. Tonight, no such luck. It was navigation by memory and touch. His clothes, a pair of trousers so patched they were more patch than trouser, and a shirt that had seen better decades, were a damp, cold lump by the wall where he'd left them. Pulling them on was like dressing in chilled dishcloths. The coarse fabric chafed his skin, already rubbed raw in places from yesterday's harness. Delightful. He had to be careful not to tread on a sibling. They were scattered like dropped potatoes in the dark. A small, sleepy whimper told him he'd just nudged Lizzie. "Shh," he whispered, patting vaguely in her direction. His equipment was minimal. His cloth cap, essential for keeping some of the falling muck out of his hair, though less effective against rocks. The harness, the dreaded chain and girdle he'd wear to pull the tubs, lay coiled like a sleeping metal snake. He wouldn't put that on until he reached the pit. No point inviting its charming embrace any earlier than necessary. His first thoughts weren't of adventure or play. They were brutally practical, the internal monologue of a tiny, seasoned veteran of hardship. Stomachs growling, hope Ma's got a bit of bread. A sliver of fear, sharp and cold as the morning air. Mr. Griggs? Hope he's not in one of his moods. Mr. Griggs, the deputy, had a temper as fiery as any fire-damp explosion and a strap to match. Then a familiar pang. Them older lads. Hope they don't take me bait again. The thought of his lost candle stub from yesterday flickered in his mind. An extra hour of deeper darkness in the terrifying crawlways. Just grand. He could hear his father moving now. The rustle of clothes. Another cough. Soon they'd be out in the freezing drizzle on the trudge to the pit head. Billy shivered, not entirely from the cold. Another day was dawning, or rather, gloaming. Another day of darkness, dust, and dragging. For a fleeting, almost imperceptible moment, he wished he was the baby, or even one of the rats. They at least seemed to have a bit more freedom of movement and considerably better dining options, judging by the sounds of their nocturnal feasting. But then the moment passed. Wishing was a waste of energy, and energy was a precious, precious thing when your job was to be a human mule in the bowels of the earth. The walk to the pit was a masterclass in shared misery, a silent procession of ghosts in the pre-dawn gloom. Billy trotted to keep up with his father's longer, dragging steps. Thomas Ashton didn't speak. There was nothing to say that hadn't been said by the slump of his shoulders or the rasp of his breath. Around them, other figures materialized from the identical drab cottages, men and boys, all heading for the same monstrous mouth of the colliery that squatted at the edge of the village like a giant coal-belching spider. The air, already sharp with the November chill, grew thicker with the smell of smoke, damp earth, and the ever-present throat-catching scent of coal. Above, the sky was a cold, indifferent slate, just beginning to think about turning a lighter shade of miserable. So not exactly a skip to the park. First light, if you could call it that, was a weak, watery gray by the time they reached the pit head. It wasn't a gentle awakening of nature. It was the grim illumination of industry already in full, clanking swing. The colliery yard was a chaotic ballet of flickering lamps, shouting men, the hiss of steam from the winding engine, and the rhythmic clang of machinery. It was a place that had clearly never heard of a quiet zone. For Billy, the immediate task was to become part of this infernal machine. He and his father queued with the other day men, those not fortunate enough to be on a slightly less brutal shift. His father collected his own safety lamp, a precious piece of equipment for working in the gassy seams. For Billy, a drawer working in what were considered less dangerous, a relative term, meaning only slightly less likely to explode. Roadways. it was a different story. Sometimes he got a stub of a candle, which he had to provide himself and guard with his life, or a small, open-flame oil lamp that smoked, stank, and offered about as much useful illumination as a particularly surprised glowworm. Today, it was the latter. He clutched the greasy little lamp, its feeble flame already dancing nervously in the drafts. His hand, still stiff with cold, fumbled with the strap of his harness, the thick leather belt, and the chain that would soon be his constant, galling companion. He could already feel yesterday's sores throbbing in anticipation. Oh, joy. The morning's unique miseries began with the descent. Waiting for the cage, a rusty iron box that looked like it had lost a fight with a giant tin opener, was an exercise in patience and trying not to shiver too obviously. When it finally arrived, crammed with a dozen or so men and boys reeking of stale sweat and fear, Billy squeezed in. The cage dropped, not with a smooth, reassuring hum, oh no. It plummeted with a series of sickening lurches and groans from the winding gear, the darkness swallowing them whole. The only light came from the lamps, casting wild shadows on grim faces. The air grew colder, damper, and tasted of stale earth and something else, something ancient and dead. Billy squeezed his eyes shut, a tiny prayer mumbled on his lips, not to any god, particularly, but just a general plea to the universe to not let the rope snap this time. It was a daily roller coaster, minus any of the fun, and with a substantially higher chance of a messy end. Spilled out at the bottom, the main roadways were a bewildering maze of tunnels, timber supports, and iron rails. The noise down here was different, more muffled, yet somehow more intense. The constant drip, drip, drip of water, the distant thud of pickaxes, the rumble of tubs, the creak and groan of the earth settling around them as if annoyed by their presence. It was like being swallowed alive by a very grumpy, very damp monster. Billy's assigned route was a narrow, low passage leading to the seam where his father and a couple of other hewers, Elias and Big Davy, were working. First light here meant the flickering, inadequate glow of his own lamp. His cold, stiff little body protested every movement. The first task was to attach the chain from his harness to an empty coal tub. These tubs, or corves, were wooden boxes on small iron wheels. Empty, they were merely heavy. Full, they were instruments of pure torture. He had to crouch, sometimes crawl, to get through the lowest sections. The roof, rough rock and hastily placed timbers, was always eager to give your head a friendly knock if you forgot to stoop low enough. The ground was uneven, a mixture of mud, coal slurry, and sharp stones. It was slippery. Visibility was a joke. His lamp cast a tiny pool of wavering light, making the shadows leap and dance like goblins. It was perfect for tripping, stumbling, and generally making life more difficult. It was in these early hours, with the damp chill seeping into his bones and the darkness pressing in, that any lingering hope of the day being anything other than awful completely evaporated. If hope had been a candle, the mine would have snuffed it out before it was even properly lit. The first crisis of the day arrived with the punctuality of a tax collector. Billy had just managed to wrestle his first loaded tub a few agonizing yards when one of its rickety wheels lodged firmly against a protruding piece of rock in the narrowest part of the passage. The tub, laden with what felt like a small mountain of freshly cut coal, jerked to a halt, the chain biting viciously into Billy's waist. He pulled, he strained. His bare feet scrabbled for purchase on the slick floor. The tub didn't budge. It just sat there, mocking him. "Come on, you cursed thing," he grunted, his voice a thin squeak in the oppressive silence. He threw his whole meager weight into it, his small muscles screaming. Nothing. Panic began to bubble in his chest. He could hear the rhythmic chink-chink of his father's pickaxe further up the passage. If he didn't get this tub moving, the empties wouldn't get through. The hewers would have nowhere to load their coal, and then Mr. Griggs, the deputy, would appear. Mr. Griggs' appearing was rarely a cause for celebration. "What's the hold-up, lad?" The voice, rough and impatient, echoed from the darkness ahead. It was Elias, one of the hewers, his lamp appearing like an angry eye. "Get that tub shifted. We ain't digging this coal for it to sit here admiring the view." "It's stuck, Mr. Davies," Billy panted, his voice trembling slightly. "The wheel." Elias swore, a short, sharp bark. He came forward, his own lamp casting a slightly better light. He was a gaunt man, his face all angles and coal dust. He peered at the wheel, then gave the tub a contemptuous kick. "Useless. Get down and clear it, boy, and be quick about it. Time's money, even if it ain't much of yours." No offer to help, of course. That wasn't how it worked. Interactions were terse, practical, and usually bordered on hostile. Orders were barked, complaints were muttered. The pecking order was as clear as the air was thick. Hewers at the top, then various haulage workers with trapper boys and young drawers like Billy firmly at the bottom, the muck beneath the muck. Billy scrambled down, his knees pressing into the cold, sharp stones. He fumbled at the wheel with his numb fingers, trying to dislodge the rock. A shard of it scraped his knuckle, drawing a thin line of blood that was quickly blackened by the coal dust. His body, barely rested, was already rebelling. Yesterday's sores from the harness were definitely open and making their presence known with sharp, stinging complaints. New aches were blooming in his shoulders and back from the first few minutes of pulling. Exhaustion, the constant companion of every miner, was already sidling up to him, whispering sweet nothings about how very, very far away the end of the shift was, and the day had barely begun. He finally wrenched the stone free, his breath coming in ragged gasps, the coppery taste of blood and coal dust in his mouth. The brief, savage satisfaction was instantly replaced by the dread of the next tub, and the one after that, and the one after that, stretching out in an endless black parade. By mid-morning, the concept of rest had become a distant, almost mythical idea for Billy, like dragons or a hot meal. Each trip with the coal tub felt longer than the last, each load heavier. The initial aches and pains had now settled in as permanent residents, throwing a housewarming party in his joints and muscles. His shoulders burned from the constant chafe of the harness. The raw patches on his waist, where the leather belt and chain bit deepest, had progressed from stinging to a dull, insistent throbbing. It was like his own personal, very localized torture device, thoughtfully provided by the colliery. Lucky him. The escalating physical demands were a cruel joke. You'd think a 10-year-old body would adapt, get stronger. And perhaps it did, in some twisted way. But the work had a nasty habit of escalating right alongside any newfound stamina, eager to crush it like a beetle under a hobnailed boot. The hewers, warmed up and in their rhythm, were sending out coal at a furious pace. More coal meant more tubs. More tubs meant Billy had to move faster, pull harder, and stumble back quicker for the next load, his small lungs sawing for air that always felt too thin and too dusty. Time itself seemed to stretch and warp. The minutes crawled by with the enthusiasm of a snail wading through treacle. Yet the demand for more coal now was instantaneous and unceasing. Above ground, the weak November sun might have been making a brief, watery appearance, perhaps even attempting to cheer up the desolate landscape. Down in the pit, the environment had its own charming way of evolving. The air, never exactly alpine fresh, grew thicker, staler. The dust from the hewing, from the transit of countless tubs, and from the dry, crumbling rock strata hung heavy, catching in Billy's throat and making his cough a more frequent rasping companion. It was like breathing sandpaper. The further reaches of some passages also became noticeably warmer and stuffier as the morning wore on. Not a comfortable warmth, but a close, suffocating heat that made sweat run into his eyes and down his already filthy back. The increased activity meant more traffic on the main haulage ways, more boys, more ponies, more shouting, more chances for a heavily laden tub to jump its rails, or for a tired child to make a stupid, painful mistake. And a mistake, of course, was inevitable. Exhaustion is a terrible proofreader for one's actions. Billy was hauling a tub through a particularly low section, his back bent almost double, his head down, every muscle screaming in protest. His little oil lamp, sputtering and dim from a dwindling supply of cheap oil, cast just enough light to make the darkness confusing. He was supposed to count the timbers marking a side passage, the one leading to a different hewing team. Distracted by a sharp pain as the harness chain snagged on a protruding rib, his own, not the tub's, he lost count. Or maybe he never really had it. He dragged the tub a few yards further than he should have, into the wrong gallery. He only realized his error when a voice, rougher than a badger's backside, bellowed from the gloom. "Oi, where do you think you're going with that, you little runt? This ain't your coal." It was a different hewer, a burly man named Jenkins with a reputation for having the patience of a hungry bear. Jenkins emerged from the side passage, his face a mask of coal dust and fury. Billy froze, his heart hammering. The consequences of such an error weren't just a telling off. It meant wasted time and effort for him, a delay for Jenkins's own drawer, and worst of all, it meant the hewers in his own section, including his father, wouldn't be getting their empty tub. This cascaded nicely into a symphony of anger, all directed at one small, terrified boy. I thought, Billy stammered, but Jenkins cut him off. "You thought? You ain't paid to think, boy. You're paid to shift this black stuff from A to B. Now get it back where it belongs and be quick about it before I fetch Griggs to have a word with your backside." The effort of reversing the heavy tub in the narrow, dark passage was monumental. His muscles, already screaming, now shrieked in protest. He had to unhitch, maneuver the tub by hand, bruising his shins and scraping his knuckles raw against the rough walls. Jenkins stood by, arms crossed, offering helpful criticisms like, "Put your back into it, you idle whelp," and "My granny could move it faster, and she's been dead 10 years. The dry humor was, as always, impeccable. This little detour also meant he crossed paths with the very individuals he'd been dreading, a trio of older, bigger lads who worked as putters on a slightly wider haulage way. They were known for their casual cruelty, a product of their own miserable existence perhaps. But that was no comfort to Billy. They saw him struggling, sweating, near tears. It was like sharks smelling blood. "Well, well, what have we here?" sneered the ringleader, a lanky youth named Finn. Little Cartwright lost his way, or just too weak to pull his own dinner. They blocked his path, their lamps held high, casting leering shadows. Billy tried to push past, but Finn's mate, a shorter, stockier lad called Mole, shoved him back. "Not so fast. What's in your pockets, eh? Got any bait for us hard-working lads?" Billy clutched the pocket where his pitiful piece of bread was stored. "It's mine." "Sharing is caring, ain't it, Billy?" Finn said, his voice dangerously soft. He made a grab for Billy's pocket. Billy twisted away, and the small, precious lump of bread tumbled out onto the filthy floor. Mole stomped on it with a laugh, grinding it into the coal dust and mud. Tears welled in Billy's eyes, hot and shameful. Hunger, exhaustion, and now this. It was too much. But crying wouldn't help. It would probably just amuse them more. He bit his lip, tasting blood and grime. Just then a distant shout echoed down the passage. Mr. Griggs's unmistakable bellow, wondering what the holdup was. Finn and his cronies exchanged a look. Tormenting Billy was fun, but facing Griggs's wrath was not. They gave him a final shove for good measure. "Watch yourself, runt," Finn snarled, before they disappeared back the way they came, their laughter echoing. Billy stared at the ruined bread, a fresh wave of despair washing over him. That was his entire meal until the shift ended. many, many hours from now. Strangely, the encounter seemed to mark a tiny, almost imperceptible shift. Perhaps it was the universe's idea of a sick joke, or maybe Mr. Griggs was too preoccupied with a bigger problem further down the line. When Billy finally got the tub to his father, late and trembling, his father just grunted, "Took your time," but didn't elaborate. And when Mr. Griggs did eventually stomp past, he merely shot Billy a glare that could curdle milk and barked, "Get on with it," without reaching for his strap. For a wild, hopeful second, Billy allowed himself to think, maybe it won't be so bad now. Maybe they've had their fun. This, right here, was the false promise, the little flicker of light before the tunnel gets even darker. Because no sooner had the thought crossed his mind than his father, having cleared a particularly stubborn section of coal, called out, "Right, Billy, this next one's a big un, and they want it cleared sharpish." Billy looked at the waiting tub. It seemed to be piled even higher than usual, the black diamonds glinting mockingly in the lamplight. The path back was still treacherous, his body was still screaming, and his stomach was now an aching, empty void. The brief respite, the crushed hope, made the intensified grind feel even worse. The universe, it seemed, had a truly magnificent sense of comic timing, always ensuring that just when you thought things couldn't possibly get more dreadful, they promptly did. Midday in the pit was a special kind of hell. Above ground, the November sun, however feeble, would be at its highest. People would be stopping for a proper meal, perhaps even enjoying a brief respite from their labors. Down in the Stygian gloom of the Blackheart colliery, the concept of midday was marked only by an intensification of suffering. The air, if possible, grew heavier, more choked with the fine, gritty dust that coated every surface, including the inside of Billy's lungs. In the deeper workings, where the hewers chipped and blasted, the heat began to build, a damp, cloying warmth that offered no comfort, only more sweat to sting his eyes and soak his already sodden rags. Ventilation, always a bit of an optimistic theory in these older sections, seemed to give up the ghost around noon, leaving the atmosphere thick enough to chew. For Billy, the environmental apex wasn't about sunshine and warmth. It was about the darkness becoming more absolute as his cheap oil lamp sputtered, threatening to extinguish itself with every jolt of the tub. It was about the damp chill in his usual passage being replaced by an oven-like stuffiness if he had to venture near the deeper seams to collect a tub directly from a new, hotter stall. The metal of the tub chains felt hotter, the rough wooden sides of the corvées more abrasive against his scraped skin. Even the rats seemed more aggressive, perhaps driven mad by the same oppressive conditions. One particularly bold specimen, the size of a small cat and twice as mean-looking, actually hissed at him from a shadowy ledge. Billy hissed back, a pathetic, wheezing sound. The rat, unimpressed, twitched its whiskers and continued to judge his life choices. The worst task of the day often wasn't a specific named horror, but rather his usual job amplified by circumstance and his own deteriorating condition. Today it involved a section of his main haulage route that had developed a squeeze. The immense pressure of the earth above was slowly, inexorably pushing the timber supports inwards. The passage, never generous, was now so narrow that the tubs scraped both sides, and the roof was low enough to force Billy into a painful, crouching scramble, dragging the tub with his body contorted like a broken doll. Each passage through this section was a gamble. Would a timber snap? Would the roof decide to become the floor? Good times. And it was here, in this constricted, airless rat hole, that Mr. Griggs, the deputy, chose to find him. Not that Griggs needed a reason. "Cartwright, this tub ain't moving itself. You trying to grow roots, boy?" Griggs's voice was a whip crack. He was a bull of a man, his face permanently ruddy under the coal dust, his eyes like chips of granite. Billy, straining with a particularly heavy load, his feet slipping in the greasy mud, could only gasp, "It's tight, sir." "Tight?" Griggs sneered. It ain't half as tight as my patience with you lazy whelps. I want this section cleared, and I want it cleared now, or by God I'll find a boy who can." He punctuated this with a meaningful tap of the stout cane he always carried. It wasn't just for walking. So, Billy pulled. He pulled until his muscles burned with an acid fire, until black spots danced in his vision, until the skin on his hands, already blistered and broken, felt like it was being peeled away. The chain around his waist was a band of pure agony. Each breath was a ragged, painful intake of dust and despair. This wasn't work. This was a slow-motion disassembly of a 10-year-old boy. Then came the meal break, or for Billy, the designated period of watching others eat. His own pathetic crust of bread was now an unrecognizable smear on the floor of a distant passage, a victim of Finn and Mole's charitable lunchtime redistribution program. While the older miners and luckier boys found a slightly less damp patch of ground to squat on, pulling out their bait, Billy could only stand and watch, his stomach a hollow, aching cavern. The food on display was hardly a feast. Lumps of coarse bread, perhaps a sliver of hard cheese, or a cold, greasy piece of bacon fat. Some had tin bottles of weak, lukewarm tea, or even small beer, which was probably safer than the mine water that dripped from the walls. Water that tasted of iron, sulfur, and the ghosts of long-dead ponies. They ate quickly, wolfishly, their faces grim and streaked with sweat and coal. There was no laughter, no cheerful banter, just the sound of chewing and the occasional phlegmy cough. Rest was a luxury they couldn't afford. This was merely refueling, like stoking a furnace, before being thrown back into the fray. His father, Thomas, sat a little way off, his back against a timber prop. He unwrapped a piece of bread and a small onion. He glanced at Billy, then quickly looked away, his own face a mask of exhaustion and grim resignation. He knew Billy had no food. Billy knew he knew. But Thomas's portion was barely enough for a grown man burning thousands of calories a day. To share would be to endanger his own ability to work, and thus endanger the whole family. It was the brutal, unspoken calculus of poverty. Billy didn't expect anything. Expectation was a dangerous path to disappointment. He just chewed on the inside of his cheek, trying to trick his stomach into thinking it was getting something. The physical breakdown wasn't far behind the hunger. Back in the squeeze, hauling another tub that seemed to weigh more than a small house, Billy's body finally decided it had had enough of this nonsense. His legs, trembling uncontrollably for the last hour, suddenly buckled. His grip on the tow rope, slick with sweat and grime, failed. He stumbled, a wave of dizziness washing over him, the flickering light of his lamp swimming before his eyes. He fell heavily against the rough wall, his head cracking against a protruding rock. For a moment, the world went silent, replaced by a high-pitched ringing in his ears. The heavy tub, momentum unchecked, rumbled forward, threatening to crush his legs. He scrabbled desperately, blindly, fueled by a primal terror. He managed to roll, just barely, into a slight depression in the wall as the iron-bound corner of the tub scraped past, inches from his face, sending a shower of grit and stone chips over him. He lay there, gasping, heart hammering like a trapped bird, the taste of blood and fear coppery in his mouth. The thought, "This is it. This is how Jack died," flashed through his mind, cold and sharp. He wasn't far wrong. This was how men and boys died every week in the pits. A moment of exhaustion, a slip, a slight miscalculation, and the indifferent crushing weight of the earth or its products did the rest. Just as he was trying to push himself up, his limbs shaking violently, the midday incident arrived to add a little more spice to their collective suffering. A sudden, desperate shout echoed from further up the main haulage way, followed by a chorus of panicked yells and the unmistakable, terrifying sound of splintering timber and a dull, heavy thud that seemed to shake the very air. "Roof fall! Up by number 3 junction," someone screamed. Instantly, the relative quiet of the meal break, or Billy's personal crisis, was shattered. Men scrambled to their feet, lamps bobbing wildly. Mr. Griggs was already running, bellowing orders. "Stay clear, you lot! Hewers from number 3? Anyone out?" Panic, sharp and contagious, rippled through the nearby galleries. A roof fall could mean anything from a minor inconvenience to multiple deaths. It meant trapped men, desperate rescue attempts, and a grim reckoning with the ever-present dangers. Billy, still pressed against the wall, watched as his father and Elias exchanged a grim look, then joined the rush towards the incident, their own exhaustion momentarily forgotten in the face of a greater, shared crisis. For a few minutes there was chaos. Shouted instructions, the clang of shovels and picks being grabbed, the terrified whinnying of a pit pony caught too close to the unstable area. Billy remained where he was, too shaken and weak to move, a forgotten casualty of his own minor disaster. The darkness seemed to press in on him, filled with the sounds of fear and the unseen, unimaginable horror that might be unfolding just a few hundred yards away. The peak of suffering had well and truly arrived, a multifaceted tableau of personal agony and communal dread. And the shift wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The afternoon in the Blackheart Colliery wasn't so much a measure of time as a descent into a deeper layer of exhaustion. The dramatic crises of midday had passed, the roof fall thankfully minor and resulting in only a few bruises and a lot of swearing. Now the hours stretched before Billy like an endless, dark, and very damp tunnel, which coincidentally was also his literal reality. The work hadn't changed, but his ability to cope with it had frayed to a single, trembling thread. Monotony became the new overlord, a tyrant more insidious than Mr. Griggs. Pull the tub, stumble through the darkness, listen to the squeal of the ill-fitting wheels, feel the chain bite, return for another, repeat, ad nauseum, ad infinitum, it felt. His movements became mechanical, his small body a poorly maintained automaton. Each step was a negotiation with protesting muscles. Each breath was a conscious effort in the stale, recycled air. The rhythm of his suffering was hypnotic. Strain, pain, release, briefly, then strain, pain, release again. It was a lullaby of pure, unadulterated misery, sung by the creaking timbers and the distant chink of pickaxes. He was a tiny cog in a vast, uncaring machine, grinding him down one rotation at a time. If he thought too hard about how many more tubs, how many more hours, a cold dread would wash over him, so he tried very hard to think of nothing at all. A particularly challenging task when nothing is all you can see. But the mind, even a 10-year-old's, rebels against emptiness, especially when fueled by hunger and extreme fatigue. Mental degradation began to set in, like rust on iron. Billy started to see things in the flickering dance of his failing lamp. The shadows on the tunnel walls writhed into grotesque faces, their silent mouths seeming to mock him. A pile of discarded timbers looked, for a terrifying moment, like the still form of his brother Jack. He blinked, and it was just wood again. But the image lingered. He once found himself talking to an imaginary pit pony, offering it a non-existent piece of his stolen bread, only to be startled back to reality by the rough scrape of the tub against the wall. Had he said that aloud? He glanced around, but no one was near. The darkness kept his secrets and his encroaching madness. These mental slips led to mistakes. Small ones, thankfully, but dangerous nonetheless. He'd sometimes find himself pulling on a tub that was already chalked and waiting for collection by the main haulage, earning him a confused stare from a pony driver. Once, emerging from his passage, he turned left instead of right, heading deeper into an unused, unlit section, before the sheer, terrifying silence and the sudden absence of any guiding lamps made him realize his error. The panic of being truly alone and lost in the inky black. even for a few minutes, was a fresh hell. He fumbled his way back, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs, expecting at any moment to feel Mr. Griggs's hand on his collar. The reprimand, when it came from his father for the delay, was surprisingly mild, more weary than angry. "Daydreamin' again, lad. Keep your wits about ye, or this place'll swallow you whole." Sound advice, if only wits weren't a luxury item Billy could no longer afford. The afternoon crisis, when it arrived, was less a bang and more a long, drawn-out whimper of failing equipment. His little oil lamp, his beacon in this Stygian nightmare, had been threatening to give up the ghost for hours. Despite his best efforts to conserve fuel, tipping it carefully, shielding it from drafts, the flame finally dwindled to a tiny blue speck, flickered defiantly, and then winked out, plunging him into absolute, terrifying darkness. It was a blackness so profound it felt solid, like being wrapped in velvet soaked in ink. He froze, his breath catching in his throat. He was midway through his passage, the tub heavy behind him. He couldn't see his own hands in front of his face. "Da?" he called out, his voice a pathetic squeak. "Me lamp's out." Silence. Or rather, the usual symphony of mind sounds, drips, creaks, distant rumbles, now amplified by his blindness, each one a potential threat. He knew he couldn't stay there. He was blocking the way. He also knew that trying to move the tub in total darkness was a recipe for disaster, for himself and the tub. Getting a relight was a trial. He'd have to abandon his tub, feel his way along the treacherous passage to his father's station, hope his da had a spare spill, or could light his wick from his own safety lamp. A tricky and sometimes forbidden act, depending on the gassiness of the scene. Every step was a terrifying unknown, his hands outstretched, his feet shuffling, expecting at any moment to trip, fall, or walk into a timber support. It was like being a newborn kitten, but with significantly more industrial hazards. It was during this blind stumble that one of those small, almost imperceptible human moments pierced the gloom. As he felt his way along the wall, his hand brushed against another, smaller hand. It was one of the trapper boys, young Timsy, no more than 7, who sat all day in the dark by his ventilation door. Timsy usually just grunted when Billy passed. But now, in the shared terrifying blackness, Timsy's small voice whispered, "This way, Billy. Your da's just past my door. Mind the loose sleeper. 2 steps on." That tiny piece of guidance, that unexpected act of solidarity from another small soul lost in the dark, felt enormous. It was a flicker of connection in a world designed to isolate and break. Billy mumbled his thanks, his throat tight, and found his way. His father, with a sigh that spoke volumes of his own weariness, managed to relight Billy's lamp after a few tense minutes of fumbling. No words were exchanged beyond the necessary, but for a brief moment, Billy didn't feel quite so utterly alone. It was a small mercy, like finding a single, slightly less rotten berry in a cartload of spoiled fruit. You wouldn't call it a feast, but you'd take it. Time in the afternoon played cruel tricks, sometimes lost in the hypnotic rhythm of the pull and return. An hour might pass in a seeming blur of aching limbs and dusty air. Billy would wake up to find he'd cleared several tubs without any distinct memory of doing so. At other times, particularly when stuck behind a delay or struggling with a stubborn load, each minute stretched into an eternity. The end of the shift, the mythical hour when they could ascend to the surface, felt like a distant shore that never got any closer, no matter how hard he rowed his little boat of misery. He'd catch himself listening for the bell or the hooter that signaled the shift's end, his ears straining, only to be met with the same monotonous drip and clang. The sun, he knew, must be sinking in the world above, but down here, its schedule was irrelevant. There was only pit time, a dark elastic substance that could contract and expand with no regard for human sanity. The only certainty was that it would continue, seemingly forever. The endless grind. Section 6. Evening. False hope of an end. Rewritten. The transition from late afternoon to what the surface dwellers might term evening was, in the subterranean world of the Blackheart Colliery, an exercise in subtle torture. There was no gentle dimming of a sun, no painted sky to mark the day's closure. Instead, it was a slow, almost imperceptible thickening of the darkness, a gradual starvation of the already meager light offered by their flickering lamps. Billy's relit oil lamp, a small smoky sentinel against the abyss, seemed to understand the shift. It began to sputter, with a more pronounced desperation, the flame shrinking and flaring like a dying breath, casting an ever smaller circle of unreliable, jaundiced light. Around him, in the vast echoing network of tunnels, other lights were undergoing similar agonies. Some winked out entirely, plunging sections of the mine into a sudden terrifying blackness, until a hurried relighting could be attempted, often accompanied by a string of curses that were inventive even by pit standards. This fading illumination wasn't just an inconvenience, it was an active, malevolent force. The familiar geography of Billy's haulage route transformed into a landscape of lurking threats. Protruding rocks, previously navigated with a weary, subconscious skill, now became ankle-twisting traps, their edges softened into indistinct blurs by the failing light. Patches of slick, greasy mud, always present, now seemed to expand, their surfaces reflecting the dying lamplight with a treacherous gleam. The timber props, those crucial wooden sentinels holding back the immense pressure of the earth, seemed to melt into the surrounding rock, their reassuring solidity replaced by vague, menacing shapes. Billy found himself constantly reaching out a hesitant hand to touch the tunnel wall, a blind man's gesture, trying to gauge distances and avoid collisions that his eyes could no longer reliably prevent. The sounds of the mine also seemed to change. The constant drip of water became louder, each drop echoing like a hammer blow in the intensified silence between the clatter of tubs. The groans and creaks of the earth settling around them took on a more ominous, personal tone, as if the mine itself was stirring in the growing dark, resentful of their continued presence. This was the dreaded evening push, the period where the colliery demanded its pound of flesh, and then some. Exhaustion had long since become a baseline state for every man and boy in the pit. Muscles, stretched and strained for over 10 hours, now screamed with a fiery intensity. Joints felt like they were filled with grit, each movement a fresh wave of agony. Mental acuity had dulled to a blunt, throbbing numbness. Yet, the work did not lessen. If anything, the pace seemed to quicken, driven by the foreman's increasingly sharp commands and the desperate shared desire to simply be done. It was in these hours that vigilance wavered, that hands slipped, that tired feet stumbled. Accidents, always hovering like unseen vultures, found their ripest opportunities. Billy witnessed one such moment of near catastrophe, a scene that played out in ghastly, flickering chiaroscuro. Two hewers, Big Davy and Elias, men whose faces were already deeply etched with fatigue and coal dust, were working side by side in a cramped alcove where the coal seam narrowed. Their lamps, casting long, dancing shadows, illuminated their straining bodies as they swung their heavy pickaxes. Their dialogue, earlier just terse and practical, had now acquired a dangerously frayed edge. "Watch your swing, Davy," Elias snapped, his voice raspy. He'd had to jump back as Davy's pick on the backswing came perilously close to his head. "Mind your own cursed business, little man," Davy retorted, his own breath coming in ragged gasps. He was a larger man, but visibly swaying with fatigue. "There's barely room to spit in this hellhole, let alone swing proper." "There'll be less room if you split my skull open," Elias shot back, his fear making his voice shrill. He gestured with his own pick. "You've been wild all day, and you've been whining like a kicked cur." Davy took a clumsy step forward, his heavy boot skidding on a loose stone. He stumbled, his bulk lurching towards Elias, his pickaxe held loosely in his hand. For a heart-stopping moment, it seemed certain he would impale Elias against the rock face. Elias cried out, a thin, terrified sound, trying to scramble away in the impossibly tight space. Billy, who had just arrived with an empty tub and was waiting for them to clear space for it, froze, his own small lamp casting a feeble light on the unfolding drama. He could see the whites of Elias's eyes, wide with terror. It was Billy's father, Thomas, working just a few feet away, who averted disaster. With a speed born of long experience with pit dangers, rather than any remaining physical energy, he dropped his own tool and lunged, grabbing Davy's arm just as the point of the pick was inches from Elias's chest. Enough! Thomas's voice was a low growl, but it cut through the rising tension. Davy, get a hold of yourself, man, and you, Elias, hold your tongue. We're all dead on our feet. A moment's carelessness will see one of us dead for real. Davy, shocked into a semblance of awareness, allowed himself to be pulled back, his chest heaving. Elias was trembling, leaning against the wall for support. The immediate danger passed, but it left a toxic residue of fear and anger. Mr. Griggs, the deputy, attracted by the commotion, arrived moments later, his face a thundercloud. What's this caterwauling? More interested in killing each other than killing Cole, are we? His glare swept over them, lingering on Davy's still shaking form. Any more of this and you'll both be out on your ears, and to hell with your pay. Now get back to it. The injustice of it, exhausted men pushed to the brink, then blamed for snapping, was a standard feature of pit life. Billy had his own intimate brush with disaster not long after, a consequence of his dwindling lamp and the treacherous terrain. He was guiding a heavily laden tub out of the narrow, uneven passage that was his personal Via Dolorosa. The flame in his lamp chose that precise moment to give a final dramatic sputter and die, plunging him into an impenetrable velvety blackness. He gasped, instinctively flinging a hand out to the rough wall, the other still gripping the tow rope connected to the tons of shifting coal behind him. The tub, possessing a malevolent inertia of its own, continued to rumble forward. His foot, searching for purchase in the unseen mire, slipped on a loose, wet stone. He felt his ankle twist with a sickening wrench, a sharp, searing pain shooting up his leg. He cried out, a small, involuntary yelp, as he pitched sideways, directly into the path of the oncoming iron wheels. Time seemed to stretch and distort. In that sliver of a second, he saw not his life flashing before his eyes, but the mangled body of his brother Jack, pulled from a rockfall. He smelled the metallic tang of blood mixed with damp earth. He felt the cold dread of finality. Then, pure animal instinct took over. With a desperate, agonized contortion, fueled by adrenaline and terror, he threw his small body flat against the grimy floor, pressing himself into the narrow gap between the tub's wheels and the tunnel wall. The iron-bound edge of the tub scraped past his head with less than an inch to spare, the monstrous weight of it making the ground beneath him tremble. A shower of dislodged coal dust and grit rained down on him. He lay there, heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird, his twisted ankle screaming, the darkness absolute and suffocating. He could hear the tub rumbling on for a few more feet before it, too, snagged on some unseen obstacle and ground to a halt. For a long moment, Billy didn't move, didn't breathe. He was a small, terrified creature, lost and injured in the bowels of the earth. The silence, once the tub stopped, was profound, broken only by his own ragged gasps and the distant, muffled thuds of the mine. He fumbled for his tinderbox, his fingers clumsy and shaking, but the flint was damp, the tinder reluctant. Panic, cold and sharp, began to rise. To be lightless was to be helpless, a target for any number of unseen hazards. It was the distant, approaching flicker of another lamp that saved him from complete despair. It was his father, who, having noticed the sudden extinguishing of Billy's light and his failure to reappear, had come looking for him. "Billy, lad, where are you?" Thomas's voice, strained with its own exhaustion, was the most beautiful sound Billy had ever heard. "Here, da. Me ankle. I'm hurt." Getting Billy untangled, his ankle assessed, badly sprained, not broken, was the grim diagnosis, and his lamp relit took precious, painful minutes. The delay, of course, did not go unnoticed. Mr. Griggs appeared again, drawn by the halt in production like a fly to filth. His initial tirade about carelessness was cut short, not by compassion, but by the pragmatic realization that an injured drawer was a useless drawer. "Well, he ain't shifting coal like that, is he?" Griggs grumbled, more to himself than to Thomas. "Damned nuisance, these half-pint weaklings." The incident, however, did not herald the end of the shift. That was the true, soul-crushing blow. Just as Billy, leaning heavily on his father, began to entertain the faintest, desperate hope that he might be sent to the surface, the word came down the line, passed from ganger to ganger in weary, resigned tones. "Engine fault at the shaft head. No one up for another hour, maybe 2. And the buddy wants number 4 seam cleared before we stand down." If Billy's heart could have sunk any lower, it would have burrowed its way to the center of the earth. Another hour? 2? With a throbbing ankle in this living tomb? The disappointment was a physical weight, pressing the air from his lungs. He saw the same despair reflected in his father's eyes, a flicker of hopelessness quickly masked by the grim endurance that was the miner's default expression. The brief, false hope of an end, brought on by his injury, had been cruelly snatched away. There was to be no early reprieve. The journey to number 4 seam, where they were now to assist with loading rather than hauling, was a special kind of torment for Billy. His father, despite his own bone-deep weariness, half carried, half dragged him through the labyrinthine passages. Every jolt sent fresh waves of agony through Billy's ankle. The air in this new section was even fouler, the heat more oppressive. The other men and boys they passed were specters in the gloom, their faces drawn and gray, their movements slow and mechanical. The conversations he overheard were fragments of delirium, the ramblings of men pushed beyond their limits. Could swear I saw old Megan with her lamp, plain as day. But she's been gone 5 years. If I eat one more bite of dry bread, I reckon my teeth'll turn to dust and blow away. A brief, harsh laugh from someone. More chance of us blowing away first, mate, if this fire damp gets any thicker. Old Hemlock, the ancient miner who seemed to be a permanent fixture of the pit, was crooning a tuneless, mournful song under his breath, something about a lass lost at sea, though the only sea they knew was one of coal. It was the camaraderie of the damned, a shared descent into a collective exhaustion so profound it bordered on madness. They were all in this together, not by choice, but by the grim lottery of birth and circumstance. And the end, the true end, was still a distant, almost unimaginable speck of light in an endless, suffocating night. The ascent from the Blackheart Colliery was not so much a journey from work to rest as a transition between 2 distinct types of suffering. The cage, crammed with filthy, exhausted bodies, jutted its way upwards, each clank and groan of the winding gear a punctuation mark on a day that had already stolen too much. For Billy, the journey was a particular torment. His sprained ankle, now swollen to the size of a small misshapen turnip, and a symphony of throbbing blues and purples under the coal grime, sent jolts of agony up his leg with every movement of the cage. He leaned heavily against his father, trying to keep his foot from touching anything, a feet in the packed confines where men swayed and stumbled like broken scarecrows. The air in the cage was thick with the smell of stale sweat, metallic blood, and the ever-present clinging odor of coal damp and blasting powder, the perfume of their profession. Emerging into the murky twilight of the surface world felt less like a liberation and more like being coughed up by some subterranean beast. The November air, raw and biting, cut through their damp, ragged clothes, and the last vestiges of daylight painted the colliery yard and the surrounding slum housing in hues of gray and deeper gray. There was no triumphant march home. It was a slow, painful shuffle, a procession of broken figures dragging themselves towards whatever hovel they called shelter. Thomas Ashton, his own face a mask of bone-deep weariness, supported much of Billy's weight, his arm strong around Billy's shoulder. Each step for Billy was a fresh wave of nausea-inducing pain from his ankle. He gritted his teeth, tears welling in his eyes, but he made no sound. Crying wouldn't make the walk shorter or the pain less. It was a lesson learned early and often in his 10 years of life. Their one-room hovel, when they finally reached it, offered little in the way of comfort, but it was at least not the actively malevolent environment of the pit. The single small window was a dark, unblinking eye in the gloom. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of wood smoke from the meager fire his mother, Sarah, had managed to keep alive, mingled with the familiar sense of unwashed bodies, damp earth, and the underlying sourness of poverty. His younger siblings, Emily and the two little ones, were huddled near the hearth, their small faces pale and smudged in the dim light of a single tallow dip that cast more shadows than illumination. The evening meal was a grim affair, a testament to scarcity and desperation. Sarah looked up as they entered, her eyes shadowed with her own endless fatigue, immediately going to Billy's injured ankle. A flicker of something, anger, despair, perhaps a fleeting maternal pain, crossed her face before it settled back into its usual stoic mask. "What happened to him?" she asked, her voice flat, addressing Thomas. "Twisted his ankle. Slipped in the dark. Lamp went out." Thomas grunted, carefully lowering Billy onto the straw pallet that served as their communal bed. There were no accusations of carelessness, no wasted words. Accidents were part of the fabric of their lives. Sarah merely nodded, her lips tightening. The meal itself was a thin, watery gruel, little more than boiled oats and perhaps a few scraps of turnip, served in chipped earthenware bowls. There was a small, hard loaf of dark bread, which Sarah divided with a ruthless precision born of long practice. Billy, propped uncomfortably against the damp stone wall, found that even the act of eating was a struggle. His body ached with a weariness so profound that lifting the spoon to his mouth felt like a Herculean effort. The pain from his ankle radiated upwards, making him feel sick to his stomach. Every swallow of the bland, gritty gruel was difficult. He watched his father eat, slowly, methodically, his eyes distant. Thomas, too, was clearly running on fumes, the day's extended labor having drained him completely. The younger children ate with a subdued hunger, their small hands clutching their spoons, their eyes darting towards the bread, hoping for an extra crumb. There was a brief, tense moment when young Lizzie, the sickliest of the children, began to cough. A dry, rasping sound that echoed her father's more profound affliction. Sarah's hand went to Lizzie's forehead, a gesture of automatic, worried tenderness. The social dynamics around food were unspoken, but rigidly enforced. There was no hoarding, for there was little enough to hoard. Stealing was unthinkable within their small, desperate unit. The true wolves were outside. What little they had was shared, but the shares were meager, never enough to truly satisfy the gnawing hunger that was their constant companion. Billy, despite his own emptiness, found he couldn't finish his portion. The pain and exhaustion had stolen his appetite. He pushed his bowl slightly towards Emily, who looked at her mother first, then quickly scraped the remaining spoonfuls into her own bowl, her eyes offering a fleeting, silent thanks. Bodily maintenance after such a day was a cruel joke, a futile ritual performed in the dim, flickering light. Thomas managed to find a relatively clean rag and a bowl of cold water. Sarah, Her face set in grim lines gently bathed Billy's swollen ankle. The water was icy, and the touch, however gentle, sent fresh spasms of pain through him. But he clenched his jaw and endured it. There were no medicines, no ointments. She bound it tightly with another strip of rag, a poor substitute for a proper bandage, but all they had. "Keep off it as much as you can," she muttered, the advice almost laughable in their circumstances. How could he keep off it when tomorrow meant the pit again? Or worse, no pay if he couldn't work. He watched his father attempt his own ablutions, stripping off his sweat-stiffened pit shirt to reveal a torso crisscrossed with old scars and fresh abrasions, his skin permanently ingrained with a fine layer of coal dust that no amount of cold water and harsh soap could ever fully remove. Thomas splashed water on his face and chest, the gasps of cold sharp in the small room. There was no real cleanliness to be achieved, only the brief, illusionary sensation of washing away the day's worst grime. Their clothes, caked with mud and sweat, would be scraped and perhaps hung near the dying fire, to be donned again, still damp, in a few short hours. Tools, for men like Thomas, would be checked by feel, the edge of a pick, the haft of a shovel, any damage noted for a repair that would likely have to be improvised. Tomorrow's problems, Billy knew, were already casting their long shadows. His ankle was tomorrow's problem, a big one. Social time was not a concept that held much meaning here. It was more a shared breathing space, a collective acknowledgement of having survived another day. Thomas sat by the dying embers of the fire, staring into them as if seeking answers that weren't there. Sarah mended a tear in one of the children's garments by the guttering candlelight, her fingers moving with a slow, practiced weariness. Emily, a quiet, observant child, was trying to fashion a doll from a piece of wood and a scrap of cloth, her small face serious with concentration. The two youngest had already succumbed to exhaustion, sprawled like discarded puppets on the straw, their breathing shallow, occasionally punctuated by Lizzie's unsettling cough. The gallows humor that sometimes flickered in the pit was absent here. The hovel was too small, the reality too close for such deflections. There was an unspoken tension, the weight of worries too heavy to voice. The cost of food, the ever-present threat of sickness, the fear of eviction if the rent wasn't paid, the gnawing anxiety of what another accident, another injury, might mean for their precarious survival. Yet these fragile connections, these silent acknowledgments of shared hardship, were what kept them from dissolving completely into the darkness. Thomas reached out a calloused hand and rested it briefly on Billy's head. It wasn't a gesture of overt affection, but a simple, grounding touch that spoke of a shared burden, a silent promise of endurance. It was a pinprick of warmth in the vast, cold emptiness. Pre-sleep rituals were a parody of comfort. Billy tried to find a position on the lumpy straw pallet that didn't send daggers of pain through his ankle. He propped it on a bundled-up rag, but every shift of his body, every movement from his father or siblings sharing the same cramped space, threatened to disturb it. The straw rustled, a dry, irritating sound. He could feel the cold seeping up from the dirt floor, a damp chill that even their collective body heat couldn't fully dispel. Before they settled, Sarah would make a cursory check for rats or other vermin, though it was a largely symbolic act. The creatures were as much a part of the household as they were. Thomas would position his few pit tools close by, a habit born of a life where one's livelihood was also one's only defense. There were no prayers for a better tomorrow, only the dull, aching hope for enough strength to face it. And then, the attempt to sleep, the ultimate illusion of rest. For Billy, it was a battlefield. His body screamed for oblivion, for the sweet release of unconsciousness. Yet, his throbbing ankle was a relentless tormentor, sending sharp, insistent signals of pain that cut through the fog of exhaustion. Every time he drifted towards the edge of sleep, a particularly vicious throb would pull him back, his breath catching in a silent gasp. The sounds of the hovel conspired against him. His father's deep, rattling cough, a sound so familiar it was almost part of the silence, nonetheless broke the stillness. Lizzie would whimper in her sleep, a small, distressed sound, followed by Sarah's soothing murmurs. Outside, the wind howled a mournful dirge around the ill-fitting door and window, and occasionally the distant drunken shouts from another dwelling would pierce the night. His mind, too, refused to settle. It replayed fragments of the day, the terrifying darkness when his lamp went out, the near miss with the tub, the angry face of Mr. Griggs, the hunger pangs, the endless agonizing rhythm of hauling. He worried about his ankle. Would he be able to walk tomorrow? Would his father have to carry him to the pit? Would they even let him work? And if not, how would they manage? These anxieties circled like starving wolves, nipping at the edges of his consciousness. He was too tired to cry, too sore to move much. He lay there, staring into the oppressive darkness of the hovel, a darkness that felt almost as profound as that of the mine. The line between the two had blurred. The illusion of rest was just that, an illusion. The brief hours of night were not a respite, but merely a pause, a shallow breath taken before the next plunge into the abyss. Eventually, after what felt like an eternity of pain and anxious thoughts, sheer, utter depletion began to claim him. Not a peaceful drifting off, but a ragged, fitful surrender, his consciousness sinking in fits and starts into a shallow, troubled doze, where dreams of falling rocks and endless dark tunnels awaited. The night offered no escape, only a brief, inadequate truce in a war that would resume with the first hint of another pre-dawn horror. Young Billy Cartwright, whose agonizing night we've just shared, wasn't some tragic anomaly, a particularly unlucky lad singled out by a cruel fate. Oh no. Billy was a statistic, a single aching drop in a vast black ocean of child laborers who fueled the mighty engine of Victorian Britain. He was one of tens of thousands, a ghostly army of small figures in the dark, their childhood sacrificed on the altar of King Cole. Think about that for a moment. While respectable Victorian gentlemen were waxing lyrical about progress and the wonders of the age, an unseen legion of children, some as young as 5 or 6, were deep underground, breathing air that would make a sewer rat cough, performing tasks that would break a grown man. It's a scale of suffering that's difficult to comprehend, like trying to count the individual grains of coal dust in a choked lung. The bitterest irony, of course, is that this ocean of childish misery was not just some unfortunate byproduct of the era. It was a crucial, indispensable component of its success. The Industrial Revolution, that grand spectacle of iron and steam, that powerhouse of innovation that made Britain the workshop of the world and the heart of a sprawling empire, ran on coal. Mountains of it, rivers of it. And that coal didn't magically leap from the earth. It was clawed out, seam by agonizing seam, by men, and to a truly horrifying extent, by boys like Billy. Why children, you ask, with a perfectly reasonable modern sensibility? Well, for one, they were cheap. Shockingly cheap. Their tiny wages were a pittance, a fraction of what a man might earn, though a man's wages were hardly a king's ransom themselves. For a family teetering on the brink of starvation, like Billy's, every farthing earned by every family member, no matter how small or how young, was the difference between a crust of bread and utter destitution. The mine owners, pillars of their communities and often devout churchgoers, weren't blind to this economic reality. They exploited it with a ruthless efficiency that would make a modern HR department blush. Secondly, children were small. In the cramped, twisting guts of the earth, where tunnels were often no more than 2 or 3 feet high, a child's size was an asset. Boys like Billy, working as drawers or hurriers, could navigate these claustrophobic passages, hauling tubs of coal where ponies couldn't go, and men could only crawl with excruciating difficulty. They were the flesh and blood conveyor belts of the early mines, nimble, at least until their bodies broke down, and easily intimidated into obedience. A small body also meant less food consumed, another charming little cost-saving measure for the system, if not for the child. So, what did their suffering actually build? What grand achievements were founded on these broken little backs and blackened little lungs? Pretty much everything that defined the Victorian age is one of unprecedented material progress. The steam engines that powered the factories, churning out textiles and tools and all manner of goods. They devoured coal. The ironclad steamships that projected British power across the globe, carrying soldiers and settlers, and manufactured goods to the farthest reaches of empire. Their boilers thirsted for coal. The railway locomotives, those snorting iron horses that crisscrossed the land, shrinking distances and transforming commerce, their fireboxes blazed with coal. Even the gas lamps that began to illuminate the city streets, pushing back the ancient reign of night for those who could afford such novelties, were fed by gas derived from, you guessed it, coal. Therein lies an irony so savage, it would be comical if it weren't so tragic. These children, living their lives in near perpetual darkness, were mining the very substance that would bring light to the cities of the wealthy. They toiled in conditions of unimaginable filth and squalor to produce the fuel that would power an age of supposed cleanliness and order for others. They endured crippled limbs and diseased lungs so that factories could churn out unprecedented volumes of consumer goods they would never own, and so that elegant townhouses they would never enter could be warmed by cheerful coal fires. They were the invisible, unacknowledged foundation upon which the entire edifice of Victorian prosperity was constructed. They built a world of wonders, a world of gleaming machinery and expanding empires, a world they would only ever experience as a source of unrelenting, backbreaking, and life-shortening labor. The fuel of progress was, quite literally, the bodies and souls of its smallest, most vulnerable citizens. And how were these tiny titans of industry, these miniature martyrs to modernity, remembered by history? For the most part, they weren't. They were erased, written out of the grand narrative with an efficiency that even their taskmasters would have admired. We remember the inventors, the Watts, the Stevensons, the Brunels, men whose genius undoubtedly shaped the age. We remember the industrialists, the entrepreneurs, the men of vision who built the factories and the railways and the fortunes. We remember the politicians, the queens, the generals. Their names adorn statues and street signs. Their biographies fill library shelves. But who remembers Billy Cartwright? Who remembers the tens of thousands like him? They are the dust beneath the triumphal arches, the forgotten grit in the gears of progress. Their voices, if they were ever heard, were dismissed as the whimperings of the ignorant or the unfortunate but necessary price of advancement. Official reports might have detailed their appalling conditions. The parliamentary blue books, for instance, contain harrowing testimony, and these did eventually lead to some reforms, however slow and grudging. But the individual child, the specific human cost, was largely absorbed into the anonymous mass of the poor or the laboring classes. Their suffering was a dirty secret, acknowledged in hushed tones by reformers, but largely ignored by a society eager to celebrate its own brilliance and power. It's always easier to admire a magnificent building if you don't have to think too closely about the bones mixed into its foundations. The sad, uncomfortable truth is that this pattern of erasure, this tendency to celebrate the fruits of progress while sanitizing the often brutal methods of its cultivation, is not unique to the Victorian era. One might argue with a weary wanderer's cynicism that it's a recurring motif in the grand, messy symphony of human history. The specifics change, of course. We no longer, for the most part, in our part of the world anyway, send 5-year-olds into coal mines with chains around their waists. but the underlying dynamic of certain populations bearing a disproportionate burden for the comforts and advancements enjoyed by others, of their labor being undervalued, their suffering unseen, or conveniently ignored. Well, that has a depressingly familiar ring to it, doesn't it? The desire for cheap goods, for convenient services, for continuous growth, often comes with hidden human costs, tucked away in distant factories, in unregulated industries, or in the desperate lives of those on the margins. So, while Billy Cartwright is a ghost from a bygone era, a representative of a particularly stark form of exploitation, the echoes of his small, painful life and the system that consumed him linger. The world he helped to build, a world powered by an insatiable hunger for energy and resources, is, in many ways, still our world. And the questions his story raises about progress, about its true cost, and about whose voices are remembered and whose are silenced, are questions that remain as relevant and unsettling today as they were in the flickering, gaslit gloom of the 19th century. He, and the countless children like him, deserve to be more than just a footnote in the story of how we got here. They are a vital, painful, and profoundly important chapter in themselves. We left little Billy Cartwright collapsing into a fitful, pain-racked doze on a pile of dirty straw, his swollen ankle a throbbing counterpoint to the chorus of coughs and restless stirrings in his family's single, squalid room. A temporary reprieve, if you could even call it that. But what of his tomorrow, and all the tomorrows after that? What did the future hold for a 10-year-old coal drawer in the heart of Victorian Britain, already physically broken and breathing air thick with the promise of a slow, choking death? Let's not sugarcoat it with misplaced optimism. The prognosis for a boy like Billy was, to put it mildly, grim. Statistically speaking, he was a flickering candle in a hurricane. If a sudden, violent end in the pit didn't claim him, a rockfall, a gas explosion, being crushed by a runaway tub, the kind of swift, brutal obliteration that haunted every miner's waking hours and sleeping nightmares, then a slower, more insidious enemy was already hard at work inside his small chest. Miner's phthisis, they called it, or black lung, a cruel, progressive disease caused by the relentless inhalation of coal dust. It would start with that persistent cough, like his father's, and gradually steal his breath, his strength, leaving him a gasping skeletal wreck before he even reached what we might consider middle age. Many miners were old men by 35 and dead by 40 or 45. For those who started their careers as children, like Billy, their already stunted growth and overburdened bodies often meant an even shorter, more brutal trajectory. His sprained ankle, a seemingly minor injury in the grand scheme of pit disasters, would likely never heal properly. Without adequate rest or medical attention, luxuries as alien to him as a trip to the seaside, it would probably become a chronic weakness, a source of persistent pain, making him less efficient, more prone to further accidents. In a world where a worker's value was measured solely by their output, such an infirmity was a death knell for his already meager earning potential. There were no pensions for the likes of Billy, no disability benefits, no compassionate leave. You worked, or you starved, or your family starved. The chances of escape from this life were infinitesimally slim. Education was a distant dream for most pit village children. Where would the time or energy come from? And who would pay for it? The mine had its claws in these families, generation after generation. Billy was born into it, and the colliery expected to consume him, just as it had consumed so many before him, and would consume so many after. He was, in the cold, hard calculus of the industrial age, a disposable component, easily replaced. So what legacy, then, for a boy like Billy Cartwright, whose life was likely to be short, brutal, and largely unrecorded? He wouldn't have a statue in a town square, no grand portrait hanging in a gallery. No obituaries would sing his praises or mourn his passing, beyond the silent, aching grief of his own impoverished family. His name, like millions of others, would be swallowed by the vast, indifferent anonymity of the past. But his legacy, and that of his countless little comrades in grime, is quite literally all around us, embedded in the very fabric of the modern world. The coal that Billy hauled, painfully and perilously, from the suffocating darkness, it didn't just disappear. It fueled the furnaces that forged the steel for the railways that still trace paths across continents. It powered the factories that birthed technologies we now take for granted. It warmed the homes and illuminated the cities that grew into the sprawling metropolises of today. The seemingly inexhaustible energy that Billy and his generation ripped from the earth kick-started an era of unprecedented global change, the ripples of which continue to shape our lives. The routes he trudged, those dark, narrow passages deep underground, may now be flooded, collapsed, and forgotten. But the seams of coal he helped to clear contributed to a vast industrial machine that reshaped landscapes, economies, and societies. The techniques of mining, though hopefully more technologically advanced and less reliant on 10-year-old boys with chains around their waists, still bear the imprint of those early, brutal methods. And yes, the system of resource extraction for profit, the relentless drive for cheaper energy and more material goods, a system that often turns a blind eye to the human and environmental cost, that, in subtly altered forms, is also part of their complex, troubling legacy. Billy's labor is an invisible thread in the great, tangled tapestry of how we got here. But it's crucial, isn't it, to remember the human element in all of this. Billy wasn't just a tiny, expendable cog in that machine. He was a child, a human being who felt pain, hunger, and fear with an intensity that we, in our relative comfort, can scarcely imagine. He knew the biting cold of a pre-dawn November morning, the gnawing emptiness of a stolen meal, the raw chafe of a harness against his skin, the terror of absolute darkness, and the searing agony of a badly injured limb. He also knew the brief, almost imperceptible warmth of his father's hand on his head, the fleeting solidarity of a shared whisper in the dark with young Timsy, the fierce primal love for his younger siblings, and the stubborn, almost unconscious will to simply keep going, to put one foot in front of the other, because that was all there was to do. These weren't grand, heroic emotions. They were small, desperate human truths experienced in the heart of an inhuman system. To forget that is to reduce him and them to mere abstractions, to economic units, and that would be the greatest injustice of all. So, the next time you flick a light switch and banish the darkness with effortless ease, spare a thought for Billy, whose only light for 12 agonizing hours a day was a sputtering, unreliable oil lamp, if he was lucky. The next time you turn up your central heating to ward off a winter chill, remember the children who shivered in subterranean damp, mining the coal that would one day, indirectly, warm your world. The next time you complain about your tedious commute, your demanding boss, or the soul-crushing grind of your 9-to-5, perhaps picture a 10-year-old boy, his body already old, his lungs already failing, harnessed like an animal to a heavy tub of coal in a passage so low he cannot stand, knowing that his day is not even half done, and that tomorrow will be exactly the same, until the darkness finally claims him. It's not about guilt. It's about perspective. It's about acknowledging the immense, often brutal, human cost that underpins so much of what we now consider normal. Our final image of Billy Cartwright, then, is not one of heroic defiance, for defiance was a luxury he couldn't afford. Nor is it one of passive victimhood, for despite everything, he endured. He fought, in his own small, desperate way, just to survive another day. Let's picture him instead at the very end of that fitful, inadequate night's rest. A small, shadowy figure stirring on the straw, as his mother's hand inevitably shakes him awake long before any hint of dawn. His eyes, even in the gloom of the hovel, are old, weary, reflecting a knowledge of hardship no child should ever possess. His sprained ankle sends a fresh throb of protest as he moves. But he rises, he always rises. A forgotten child, an essential ingredient in the great grinding engine of history, heading once more into the all-consuming blackness of the pit. A tiny ghost in the machine, his brief, painful life a testament to the true price of progress. Remember him. Remember them.